Okay. So today, last week I left off on the terrain game object, and I want to go over the terrain game object and all the tools that come with it. How many people are already familiar with the terrain object? Mark, a little bit. Okay. So, Mark, if you see anything that I don't mention, just share it with the class. And then I want to add a new scene, talk a little bit about it, creating a title scene, introducing new fonts, creating a button to load from one scene to the other scene, or also there's a script I included so that it switches scenes after a certain number of seconds, or you can set the time. So under today's date, there's there's a presentation, but there's also download demo files. So if you go to that page where I've been posting the projects, there's actually two folders. The first one has an exported Unity package, but when I tested that Unity package, when I brought it into a new Unity project on this computer, there were scripts that didn't roll over, and they had to do with the starter assets with the first person controller. So the other zipped Unity project from last week has that whole project zipped. And when I opened it on that computer, everything was fine. So you could just go with that one. But with the first one, the first download, the one that's titled, it's a zip folder week 09. It has a folder with scripts, sun control, change scene, load level after time, and rotate sky. So change scene and load level after time are two new C# scripts that I want to use today. And then Righteous is a Google font that I downloaded. So it comes with a true type font that is the file that's necessary to import into Unity if you want to introduce your own fonts. And then there's a folder with some textures. So I want to talk about textures. I want to talk about different, like the albedo, the normal, and mask, these different. In order to create a material that's reflective of light, we need different ways of mapping the pixels so that Unity can make, or any 3D software can make the most out of reflecting light and shadows and creating a sense of depth on a game object or on a 3D object. Okay, so I also brought, you guys have two iPad Pros available through Peter Jackson's office, and the iPad Pros have LiDAR scanner built in, so you can capture either a person or an object and create an OBJ that you could import into Unity and bring into your environment. So I want us to look at that. And yeah, so hopefully there should be time for all of this. And I'll get great updates out this weekend. I'm behind on that. So, all right. Close all of these files. Okay, so the type of artwork that can be brought into Unity are 2D images, flat pictures. To make a real world analogy, 2D images are like paintings and photographs. It could be you could bring in a Photoshop document if you wanted to, and just reload it if you make changes. But you can PNG is recommended because it has alpha, and although PNG, it's a lossless file type. So the algorithm does that something with pixels to make it smaller than, say, a TIFF, which would be a high file that you'd want to send to a printer, but it's still considered lossless. So PNG tends to be recommended. 3D models, such as, well, what we might be creating with the iPad Pros, or what you download from different online sources or from the Unity Asset Store. A material is a packet of information that defines the surface property of any object that the material is attached to. These surface properties can include color, shininess, and even subtle roughness. And then we looked at animation when you guys were working with Vuforia, and we downloaded animations from Mixamo. They're packets of information that define the movement of the associated object. These are detailed movement sequences created ahead of time, as opposed to code that calculates positions on the fly. And so any animation downloaded from Mixamo, we can open in the animation window in Unity and see all the keyframes that occur over time that show the movement. And then lastly, particle systems, an orderly mechanism for creating and controlling large numbers of small moving objects. Many visual effects like fire, smoke, or spraying water are created this way. So particle systems use 2D images, and you can add physics to them. You can multiply them from 10 to 1,000 or more, and you can blur them. There's all sorts of settings that, if you guys have been covering the Unity in Action book, there's several pages dedicated to particle systems and setting those up. So briefly, textures should be sized in powers of 2. I've mentioned this a few times. For reasons of technical efficiency, graphic chips like to handle textures and sizes that are to the 2nth. So 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, etc. 2048 these days is probably the minimum, even if you're going to be creating projects that are targeting mobile devices, just as these machines get more powerful. You can use non-square textures like 512 by 64, just as long as the size remains a power of 2. And textures.com, Texture Haven are linked in the syllabus, just a couple of sources. So if you're creating a project that you knew, even if it's for VR, but it's going to be tethered, it's not a Quest or Quest 2, but it's going to be tethered to a computer, then you can go, start working at 4096 or higher. Yeah, and my recommendation is to stick with 2048 unless you're targeting high-end computers, then go with 4096. You can always downsize, but you can't upgrade bitmaps without loss of quality. All right, some of this I can talk about once we go into building the terrain. Quit anything that shouldn't be running. Okay, so this is where I left off. Last week, I downloaded this starter assets that comes with a first-person controller. And actually, I'm going to rename that to FPC. I meant to use. And it's assembled from 3 prefabs. There's a main camera, there's the player follow camera, and then there's the actual object, which is supposed to be the player. So the player capsule that's made up of empty game object, that's just a Y coordinate, 1.375, which is used to place the camera at what's supposed to be kind of like a head level. And then a capsule, just so that, really the thing about the capsule is, the most important thing is that it has a capsule collider, so that if there's a wall or a box or anything, there's physics and there's collision. So in setting this up, the player follow camera has a public variable that's follow. and player camera root is what needs to be dragged in here if you were to reuse this asset from scratch. It comes, when you download it, it comes with a demo scene that has the setup, and you can just mirror it from there. Then to the main camera, the only thing that I added was the rotate sky script, so that this sky I downloaded from that website I showed last week, that you can choose from a random array of kind of outer space set of PNGs that are used to assemble a 6-sided sky. So that's just, you're creating a cube, and in the lighting window under environment, under skybox material, I'm using that space skybox. Last week I talked about procedural skies, and we did an example of that, and you could load that in place of the sky. All right, so right now the ground is just a plane, but I'm gonna delete that plane. And is anybody following along? Because I'm recording, so I can. Okay, great. So let me know if I'm going too fast. But I'll put the recording up today, like tonight. I'll link it in the syllabus. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this plane. And in place of it, I'm going to add terrain. So in 3D objects, actually, before I do that, I want to go to the top level of assets. So right now there's a scenes folder, a scripts folder. I create a folder for the skyboxes where you can find the procedural sky and the space skybox. I downloaded the standard assets, which, by the way, it's out of date. It's no longer supported. So for many years, Unity used the standard assets for people to get started in Unity, and it had a ton of files. And the reason I wanted to make use of it is because it has spree trees, it has grass, it has things that we can use with the terrain. So when I downloaded it this time, I turned everything off. Actually, we can, if I go to window and maybe it's still in the package manager. Huh. Maybe because I deleted everything. It's not. So if you wanted to use this standard assets, you can still find it in the Unity asset store. And if I were to import it, so there's audio mixers, all these materials. Oh, well, okay, I'm going to collapse the sample scenes altogether. I don't want those. Standard assets, there's 2D. I don't want the camera. I don't want the characters. Cross-platform. All of this is out of date and will throw a bunch of errors. The only thing that I do want are the environment files. Fonts, don't need them. Particles, nope. Utility, no. Vehicles, no. So what I did is I imported just the environment folder, and brought it in, and that way I didn't run into any errors. The C# files and all of that will keep me from working in my project because they'll throw errors. So I'm going to cancel this because I already downloaded it. And if you guys are using that file, that Unity project that I uploaded, it's already there. All right, so that's the environment. If I go into it, there's the speed tree, terrain assets, water, and water basic. If I look into water, there's water, water and water 4. Daytime and nighttime, and the water 4 is pretty, there's a pretty high quality water game object, which is water 4 advanced, that I think looks pretty nice, even if this is a bit dated. So in the terrain assets, there are different grasses and moss and mud, sand. So there's different textures that you could use on your terrain, but I also uploaded several separately. Then there's the starter asset, which has the first person controller. So in starter assets, there's first person and prefabs. And what I have in my scene are the main camera, the player follow, and then the player capsule. And again, the player capsule is made up of 2 game objects: player camera root, which is the Y coordinate, and then a capsule, which has a collider on it. All right. And then lastly are the PNGs for the skybox. So in the hierarchy, I'm going to create a 3D object and I'm going to add a terrain. I'll call it Earth. So I'll go over to Inspector and rename it. And in the assets, you'll notice that there's a new terrain. I will also call that Earth, just to mirror that. And so in my hierarchy, if I select it, and I'm going to look at it from up top. So I'm going to click on this widget for my different views. I'm going to look at it from up top. And the first person controller I have at the very center. So it's at the 0, 0 coordinate. So what the terrain does is it's drawn from the 0, 0 coordinate across the X coordinate 1,000 meters and then up 1,000 meters. I'm going to make it a lot smaller because this is for demo purposes. It's just too huge. You know, it's like 1,000 football fields across the X and Z coordinates. But before I do that, the first tool so we've got our transforms, position, rotation, scale, and then there's the terrain tools. And so the first tool is to create neighbor terrains. So if I turn that tool on, you can see that there's some highlighted grid elements, and I can just click on them and you can see all these extra terrain, all these other terrains are being built. So if I was building a really just huge world, it could get huge. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to undo all of that and delete all these other terrain assets and just leave Earth. So for the sake of presentation, I'm going to make Earth a lot smaller. So there's a paintbrush, paint terrain, the paint trees, paint details, and then there's terrain settings. So I'm going to go to terrain settings and scroll down. So as I scroll down, there's different settings for basic terrain, tree and detail objects, wind settings for grass, mesh resolution, and I'm full setting. So all of these top settings are attributes for whatever you paint using the paint, using the paintbrush tools and everything that comes under it. And I'm looking for, so I'm looking for the mesh resolution on terrain data. And I see that the terrain width is 1,000 by 1,000. So I'm going to make it 100 by 100. And I'm going to make the terrain height 60. So everything's still in meters, and thinking about in relation to the game, to the user. So I've reset it to that, and I'll zoom in. And I'm also going to change the position so that it's not at the, so I want to put my first person controller at the center of this terrain. So if I have it at 100 by 100, I'm just going to position the terrain at -50 on the X coordinate and -50 on the Z coordinate. And now you can see I've moved it over so that my first person controller is at the center of this terrain. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to switch out of the top view. So, oh, who needs a 3-button mouse? No? No? Oh, okay, great. All right. So I'm going to switch back to free, and I'm going to start painting. So the first, I'm going to start with raise and lower terrain. And you can see there's a little bit of instruction: click left to raise, hold shift and left click to lower. It comes with a bunch of brushes. And my recommendation with this is just start playing with it. So I think I mentioned last week, you could, I mentioned that, for example, when I was creating a project that involved Midtown, I used Google Maps and satellite view to capture a square area of Midtown, and then imported that into Unity to help me define the environment that I was creating. Similarly, in this case, I'm going to create a valley, and so I'm going to surround the user with a series of mountains so that, you know, I can make the mountain steep enough that with the settings in the first person controller, they just can't climb over and toss themselves off the world. You could, you know, if you wanted to look at like the Grand Canyon or any series of mountains and copy a real world terrain, you could use satellite view and bring it in, or you could take that image, bring it to Photoshop and create what's referred to as a height map, and then import it into Unity and use the height map to define the high areas are in white, and they will, you know, make the mountain a lot taller, and the dark areas recede. So there's brush size and opacity. The brush size is what you would expect. The opacity, the higher it is, the faster the brush works. Like so here you can see, this is my brush, and it's kind of, I'm pressing, I'm not letting go. If I change the opacity to 100, you can see all of a sudden just a single click is going to create these huge peaks. So say I want to, you know, if I hold down the shift key, I can bring down those peaks. I'll combine different brushes. Maybe I'm going to actually bring down the opacity just to 50. And maybe I'll bring the opacity even lower to 20 or 25 and create some smaller mountains that would be climbable. Okay. I'm holding down the Option key and just roving around to see what I made. And I'm going to bring down some of these peaks. So once again, holding down the Shift key. And I'm going to add a little bit on this side. So, like I mentioned, you could bring in satellite views of different terrains to work from. You could, just pencil in a terrain that you have in mind, paper on pencil, and then use that as a guide. And then I think it's useful just to try all these different brushes, and I'll hit play just to see what it looks like. Uh-oh. Why am I getting an error? I got this error yesterday, and I'm gonna save and quit and reopen it. Hopefully it will magically go away. Okay, so it's something related to scripts from the starter asset kit with the first person controller. All right, so I've got this navigable terrain, and so the reason that I made, the default on the terrain object is 1,000 by 1,000 meters, but if I had kept it at 1,000 by 1,000 meters, I wouldn't be able to demonstrate this. I would have to walk for several minutes to get to, if I'm creating a valley, to get to being able to show what this brush looks like. All right, I'm gonna pause out of that. So any questions about just using that first brush tool, the raise and lower terrain? No? Okay. Again, brush size is the scale of these mountains. If you're creating something, depending on what type of mountain, higher brush size versus lower brush size. And then opacity is you can think of it as the intensity of how quickly these mountains are raised or lowered, and using the Shift key to lower. So paint holes, honestly, I've never used it, but let's see what that does. Yeah, there's holes. I keep getting it's that same error. User- I wonder if I, All right, I'm just gonna reopen it one more time. All right. I'm gonna jump to paint texture. So last week I showed a bunch of different projects. You might remember Laurie Anderson's VR project that's at Masmoka, where it's all about storytelling and there's text and it looks like chalked text all through the walls and some really simple drawings. Another one used kind of almost like a white paper landscape where there was folding and unfolding. So the reason I show those is to think about metaphors, think about like, an environment doesn't have to be necessarily a naturalistic environment. It can be, you can think about it much more creatively and think about something that is gonna either have the user think differently about the world they're in, what does it mean, what messages are you trying to present through storytelling. So in if you downloaded the files for today, there is in the week 9 folder, there's a textures folder, and I'm going to go ahead and drag those textures into my project. So there's a series of files that are supposed to represent moss, and the one key element about a normal, when you bring in a texture that's a normal map, you have to tell Unity that, and these are the purple ones. So going back to my presentation for today. So albedo is the technical term for the base color, or this is from last week. All the shadows and highlights have been removed. A normal map, which has that violet color, use RGB channels to create the illusion of depth. The dark to light values in each, the red, green, and blue channels are used to have lighter areas pop out, whereas dark values recede to create a visual representation of depth. And we can generate those using Photoshop, and we'll do that in a little bit. And then there's a height or bump map. Those are going to be grayscale. So use luminosity to create the illusion of depth. Bump maps read light and dark areas, luminous values. White creates the illusion of pushing out the pixels, pushing them at you. Black, the illusion of pushing in the pixels away from you. Although it is a 2D image, light and dark are used to simulate depth as if it was a 3D object. And all right, you can, in Photoshop, there's a couple settings for blur and detail. And really the best thing to do is to just play with those settings and export different versions to see what settings work best for what you're after. So in those textures, there's this this image, which was, I took actually from a baby photo. I just took the face and then split the top and bottom and left and right in order to try to create a texture. And I did that not just to create a weird looking image, but to try to show that really anything can be used as a texture. So in paint texture, I'm going to use a different brush. So when you switch under the paintbrush, there's raise and lower terrain, paint holes, paint texture, set height, smooth height, stamp terrain, and I'm going to select the paint texture. So there needs to be what are referred to as terrain layers. And what the way that this is designed to be used is if you're creating a world and we think about the natural world, first would be, say, rock, then maybe grass, then maybe at the peak of the mountains there could be snow. So all of these can be terrain layers where you add one texture on top of another texture on top of another texture, and you paint on these different layers. So I'm going to create layer, and I'll go ahead and use that image, and it's automatically, since it's the only layer, it applies it to the entire terrain. Invalid editor window. I'm looking if there's something I can comment out to not keep running into this. 9. So there's a README editor, C# file missing. All right, I apologize. I'm just gonna reopen it and keep. It'd be nice to see the differences as I go, which is why. Okay, so a train made out of this pattern. But the point that I'm showing this is that right now it's flat. It's just a picture that's not really receiving too much detail as far as light. And I think it's fine if this was like for a billboard or something. But if I wanted it to be a terrain that has a sense of texture and depth, I can double click into that layer and see that there's a space for a normal map and a mask map. So Photoshop facilitates just generating the normal map and a height or bump map, not a mask map. So what I'm gonna do, which for materials, you would want to use the albedo, the normal map, and the height or bump map for any material that you want having a sense of texture and dimension. So I'm gonna open that this PNG, baby.png in Photoshop. And if I go to filter, there's two 3D filters, the generate normal map and generate bump height map. And here's where those two settings that I mentioned, blur. So these are settings that I suggested just trying different values in order to see what the effect is. And the height map is, or bump map by bumper height is, again, grayscale. I'll go ahead and export this as a PNG. I don't need transparency, which will make the file size a little bit smaller. And this is really tiny. So like I mentioned, 4096, if you're working for something that's going to be a desktop, but what was it? 1024 times 2048, 2048 by 2048, if it's something that you're working that you want to be across either mobile or desktop. But for the sake of example, I'm just going to keep this nice and small at 512. And let's see. So I'll call it baby height map. Just be height. And I'll reset it. This is another thing. All my software is not acting well. So I want to generate the normal map. So the second 3D filters. For the normal map, which will use this sort of violet-based color, and I'll export that also as a 512 by 512 PNG. Turn off the transparency and I'll call it baby normal map.png. Okay, so in my projects, I have my assets folder, and I'm going to add both of those. So in the texture settings for the normal, it has to be set. I'm selecting, this is the newly imported texture, and the violet one texture type needs to be a normal map. The height map can be left as is. And I always forget to hit apply. At the bottom of these settings, there's an apply button. And now I can go, so you can see that it created a new layer. I could rename it. And I can now, I can add to that new layer, I can add the normal map. And although this is not a mask, you can see the masks have a green color. I'm just going to go ahead and use the height map and see if it takes effect. And I'm going to hit play, and it's probably not, I'm going to have that same error, but let's see. Yeah. Okay, so those of you guys who have taken 3D animation modeling or 3D virtual environments probably know a lot more about these different maps. But as I walk across this terrain, you can see now that there's a lot more information as far as how it's reacting to light to create a sense of texture, rather than just so if I was creating a natural environment, I'd probably use this rock albedo as the primary, as the initial layer, but I'm just going to leave it as is and then add some layers on top of this. So once again, under paint texture, I'm going to click the edit terrain layers, create a new layer, and I'm going to use the moss. So I'll search for moss and choose the albedo. And to that one, I'll add the normal that's associated with it. And so you saw that it threw error, or it told me it needs to come up as a normal map. So I'm going to go ahead and set it as normal map, save it. go back to my terrain. And I'm just replacing it there. It didn't update on the fly, but and then I'm gonna add this mask, moss mask. And I'll go ahead and paint with this new layer. You can, when you paint, you can set you can lower the opacity, just like with the mountain. You can change settings if you want to have it interacting with, like, if it was rock underneath instead of a baby face. So if I wanted to add another layer with snow for the peaks, I can just create as many layers as I want in order to make a full, like a rich. So once again, create layers. So you can create layer, add layer, replace layer, remove layer. And I'll search for snow. For the snow normal, I'll make sure to change the texture type to normal. And hit apply. So, but once again, by clicking on my earth terrain, I'll select this new layer. And collapse it, open it, so I can add the normal map. And add the mask. So these I pulled, I think these are from textures.com. So if you go to those sites, you're able to look for different materials, and it will, I think, at least that site, it's all free unless you want the 4K ones. Then there might be a cost. So with this brush, I'm gonna bring up the opacity and add some snow on the peaks. And then I'll cut the opacity in half and add a little bit more lower down. Okay, so I could keep adding more layers until I got what I'm happy with. I'm gonna switch now to trees. There are other ones: set height, smooth height, stamp terrain. There used to be, they've reworked this tool. This was a third-party tool that then Unity adopted. And since I was surprised when I saw the change. The original tool had other things that I don't see here, such as creating bridges or creating a terrain that had been leveled at different tiers. I wonder if that's the stamp terrain. Huh, I'm not seeing them. At least with the smooth height, I'm seeing a subtle difference. All right, I'm just gonna keep going with the trees. So paint trees, click to paint trees, hold shift and click to erase trees, hold control and click to erase only trees of the selected type. So right now there's no trees defined. So I need to edit trees and add a tree. And I'm gonna search, I'm gonna click the under tree prefab. I'm gonna click the target button to do a search. And it's the conifer tree that I'm looking. So there's a conifer. This is from Conifer Desktop, and I'm going to add it. So this is from the standard assets environment folder. And you can see that there's a brush size, there's a density. Since this is a really small area, it's just 100 meters by 100 meters. I'm going to bring down the brush size to, I'll try 20. And the tree density, I'm going to bring down, and I don't know, I'll do, seems like for 20 by 20 meters. I'll bring it down to 10. Or 15. You can change the tree height to random, and you can lower the value. All right, let's see what this gives me. That height is too high. I'm going to bring the tree density to 30. So there's this button, mass place trees. So if this was, it gives you the mass place trees button is a very useful way to create an overall covering of trees without painting over the whole landscape. Following a mass placement, you can still use painting to add or remove trees to create denser or sparser areas. So if the default terrain is 1,000 by 1,000 meters, then, or if you create neighboring terrains, then the mass place trees makes a lot of sense. I'm not using that here because it's just a tiny, I made this terrain really small. And you can also, we could add more trees. See what other trees are here. Broadleaf. These look a lot different. Okay. There are low poly, a nice low poly pack that's free that has several different trees, which is great if you're working for something that you want. If you're working on something that you want to work smoothly on the browser, for example. Now, let's add what details are on. Do I have any? Let's see. Surface. No, there's no grass. Oh, wait, here, grass. Okay. So with the details, add grass texture and oops. All right, I'm going to try this grass frond. And I set it at 20, which was way too much. And the opacity, I'm going to go with 0.5. Let's try the other one. Add grass texture. There it is. Uh-oh, what is wrong with that one? I deleted all the scripts that came with the standard asset because there's too many errors. And it looks like that one has a script. This one does too. So maybe the standard assets is not as good of an idea as I thought. I just want to see what this is looking like. That's very tall. So we have the moss terrain. There's snow in the distance. We have the two sets of trees. There's this grass, which is kind of intense. So I think if you wanted to use these, they've exported them out of standard assets. There's a whole speed tree package or spree tree package that you can download. And then there are free grass textures. I can see there's like these trees are not meeting the terrain. So there's going to be details that I want to fix. What is stopping me here? All right. Hopefully this gives you guys an idea of the terrain tool and different options. Is this helpful? So now I want to create a new scene, and I'm going to have it be like a title scene. And from that scene, I want to go into this. I'm going to rename this scene instead of sample scene. I'll call it, I don't know, nature. So in scene, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to create, in my scenes folder, I'm going to create a new scene. I'll call it title scene. And go to that, open that new scene. We've got the main camera, directional light, and this is going to be, instead of a 3D environment, it's going to be more of like a 2D canvas overlay. So in the hierarchy, I'm going to right click and I'm going to create under UI, I'm going to create a canvas. I'll leave it, this is the only canvas I'm going to have in here, so I'll just leave it as canvas. And rather than generally, you know, whether it's something for WebGL or for Oculus, so I think the Oculus Store will target when they test projects is that the entire project should load in about 20 something, people should see something in the first like 20 seconds, 20, 30 seconds. So a title scene is a tactic to keep things really small and have it load while the rest of the project loads in the background. So I could, you know, in Illustrator or Photoshop, create like a background image that have the title there. For now, I'm just going to generate some text and I'm going to create a button, and I'm going to switch in the scene view. I'm going to turn on 2D. When toggled on, the scene is in 2D view. When toggled off, the scene is in 3D view. So I'm going to zoom into the canvas. Whoops. So the canvas is basically your viewport, whether it's on a phone or an Oculus or on the screen. And it's a 2D overlay over your environment. I could give it a black background or, something so that it doesn't have this procedural sky in view. In the canvas, I'm going to add so there's text, which is just default text. Then a few years ago, they came up with text that has, I think, more properties, Text Mesh Pro, which I think is an included package. It used to be a package that you'd have to download. But I'll go ahead and add Text Mesh Pro, import TMP Essentials. And I'm not going to import the examples or extras. So I'll have a text field in the, with my text selected in the inspector, I'll just name this title. And in the text field, it's not going to be input text. So if I turned on input text, it would be a text field like we see in, in a browser when you're filling out a form. I'm going to give this, I don't know, project name. I'll make something up. Crazy environment. And I'm just resizing it. I'm using the rect tool to resize it. So there's font assets. If I toggle this on, there's this Liberation font, and that's it. I'm gonna import. So I mentioned that in the downloads folder for week 09, there's this Righteous. So I'm gonna bring that in. And this is, I downloaded this from Google Fonts, and it comes with a TrueType font file. And I should be able to just import it and be able to use it. Let's see if it's that simple. No, it's not coming up when I search for it. If I drag it in, nope. Wonder if it's because it's, you know what, instead of using Text Mesh Pro, I'm going to create another. I'm going to go to UI and just regular text. type something in. Okay, yeah. All right. So the Text Mesh Pro has other properties which are beyond a true type font. So I'm just going to delete that. Go with the default, with the regular font. And now I can, no, not that one. Name a title. Project name. So now this righteous font is available. I'm going to make it 36 point. And center align. You can change the color. If you wanted, like, I don't know, you could add a material if you wanted to receive light. Okay, next I'm going to add a button. And I'll call this button enter. So the button is composed of a 2D image, and the default 2D image is this 32 by 32 white fill black outline button, which if you wanted to create, so clicking into the button and looking at its inspector, if you look down to where it says image, if you created a button where it says UI sprite, you could replace that. Instead of the default UI sprite, you could replace it with something that you create in Illustrator or Photoshop or whatever, and just drag it in here. You could, in this case, I could change the color. And if I scroll down to, since it's a button, it can have events. So you could change the normal color, the highlighted color, the pressed color, selected color. You know, let's have it say from green to red. Selected, disabled color. And as part of the button is a text. So it's the same as the project name text. Can I have it? I'll type in enter. Be bold. It'll be 18 point. can change the color as well, etc. All right, so to this button, so there's a couple scripts. If I go into my scripts folder already added in here are change scene and load level. So change scene, there's button change scene. It's going to look for a string. So a string is variable type. That's just a series of names. And it would be, in this case, scene name. So whatever I called it nature scene. So that would be what I type into it. So I'll go ahead and to the button, I'll add a component and it's change scene. So there's a couple ways of doing this. I added the script to the button itself. So since it's a button, it has by default an on-click event. And here it's wondering, okay, what do you want me to do when on the on-click and I need it to reference itself? So since I added this change scene script under function, whatever's in that change scene is going to be available. And I'm using a string name. And the string name is nature scene. So this is one way of doing it. Before I have to quit this because it's not going to play because of whatever error is happening. Another way of doing it is I can create an empty game object. I'll call it load level. And to load level, I'll add both. I could add both change scene and load level. So load level delay before loading, and it's going to be a 10 frame delay. 10 float. Here I can add two things. How many seconds before loading? Delay before loading is actually going to be determined by seconds, and then scene name to load. So what is going to load? So if nobody clicks on this, it's still going to load something. So I'll set it to 5 seconds, or yeah, 5 seconds. And then scene name to load, nature scene. So since I'm putting them both in this load level, when I go back to that button, I can remove it from the button itself. And instead of waiting for the button itself, which has that script, I can just use load level, which has the change scene, and set its nature scene. So it's just two different ways of applying these scripts. I don't think one way is more important, is matters as, you know, is any better than the other. So this isn't going to work unless I have both my scenes in the build settings. So if I go to File and go to Build Settings, uh-oh, what's going on? Ah, there it is. So scenes in build are it's empty. And I want to add both. I want to add the open scene and bring you to the forefront. Watch that open scene. Oh, feel like shouldn't have to open the scene to add another one. Let's see. So I dragged over nature scene. So now I have both of my scenes, and you can see that they're numbered 0 and 1. So whatever set at 0 is going to be the first scene that comes up, that's available, and then the nature scene. I'm going to change the load level from 5 seconds. I'll change it back to 10 seconds. And because of this ongoing error, I'm probably gonna have to quit, but let's see. Yeah. Oh no, no, it's not working at all. Even after I quit. Hmm. All right, I think if I just rebuilt this whole thing from scratch, I think it would be nice and tidy. Try one more time. So that starter kit first person controller came in with its own input settings that should have written over the old input settings. Reloaded something, so let's see. Nope. Okay, I can see people need a break. So I'm gonna stop there and show working example of this. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and then I'll show a working example that presents the same thing. And then we'll try the iPad Pros. Okay, we're going to take a 10-minute break. Okay, so I have a file that I was using that I was trying different things out, including a package called ProBuilder. So ProBuilder generates a grid that facilitates snapping things together. So like if you download a town package or a package with, like street and sidewalks, you can use ProBuilder to have them snap one piece of pavement next to the other one. So there's going to be some extra widgets on this, but I wanted to first, I found an error that I had when I was setting the button to change scenes. The command isn't string change scene, but button change scene. So this is what I wanted. Okay, so I've opened a file which is pretty similar, but has a bunch of other stuff. And I'm not going to run into errors. So here I have the title scene. I have the same scripts, and in the title scene, there's the load level, which was an empty game object that I added both load level after time, and I set it after 10 seconds to load nature scene. And the button has that load level added to it at runtime on click. And then the function change scene, I was using string name, but it's actually button change scene because that's what I called the function in the script and nature scene. So if I test it and I click on the button, it'll take me to this other nature scene. So in this one, there's a couple things. First, there's this low poly. This is from a free low poly pack that comes with, they're basically planes, but planes with geometry. But it also comes with some trees. And I talked about the iPad Pro and the LiDAR. So this is me trying to scan myself. And here's a scan of my living room without a texture. And then I mentioned Pro Builder Pro, and this is trying to like figure out how this Pro Builder Pro works. Okay, so these extra widgets are from that package called Pro Builder Pro. If I go to scenes, and so this extra grid is from the package that I just mentioned, Pro Builder Pro. Let me jump over. So in the present, under today's date, there's a presentation and there's a few links. There's including creating seamless textures in Photoshop, which there's tons of tutorials. There's this one that's a video tutorial, but I also, under today's date, I linked to a text-based tutorial that walks through those steps. And Pro Builder again is it's like a snapping tool. So it creates a grid, and if you've downloaded a bunch of assets and you're building, say, a city, it's almost like facilitating, like using Lego, because they snap together. But there's a bunch of other tools. If anybody's used Google SketchUp, it's something similar to, like, to Google SketchUp, but it's a prototyping tool, and this is I link to tutorials on using Pro Builder, including this. How long is this? 50-minute tutorial.
Where we bring unity to you.
Pro Grids works with, I think it actually downloads with Pro Builder Pro. There's a package called Polybrush, a polygon mesh-based alternative to the terrain. Polybrush can be found in the package manager under Unity registry. So if you're looking for something a lot less heavy than what the terrain can be, Polybrush is another example. And then the iPad Pros. Here are some examples. I've been working on a project that for which I wanted to scan the bull from Wall Street and Fearless Girl and some of these barriers. So the bull's, really big, so it's tricky to get. I couldn't get on top, but the way I'm using it, it's giant, so it's fine. And I'm using a version that has a lot of errors in it, which I prefer. But so there's 2 iPad Pros that you can check out, but you can only check them out for 2 hours. If you need more time, just let Peter know. Like if you want to scan something that's that you have to travel for, and if you're scanning something like a sculpture outside, then it's the same rules as photography. The best time to scan is either on a cloudy day or at dusk before the sun is up, because the sun is going to cause too much error. There's just going to be too much information. It's going to blow out the scan. Yeah, so the app that so 3D scanner 3D scanner app is after testing a bunch of different options, this was the best option. And I wonder if I can see if I can share my screen. I did this with my phone. I may need to be logged in with the same Apple. Okay, I think I have to be logged in with the same Apple account. Okay, so here, why don't you guys get in 2 groups of 3? Try this out. I'm kidding. All right, so on the second, oh, there we have it. Okay, so for some reason, actually, you guys come over here too. Because it's the same map and they both were loaded recently, and I don't know why they're slightly different settings. So on this one, instead of normal, we want to set to LiDAR advanced. And here you can have it be an object or a person. You can set the depth. So you can see that everything is blurred in the background. Next image. And then it's going to walk around the canopy. So I'll process it as HD. And it's not great. I should have stood further away. But you can trial 5 different settings to get it right. Then under share, there's all these different formats. I want to work on different machines, so I uploaded it to Sketchfab, but it requires a login. So for Unity, OBJ is the best option, and then I airdropped it to the machine that I was working on, and then I brought it into Unity. Anyway, I wanted to bring it up because if you want to build an environment with other elements in there, then that's an option. Yeah, if you guys want to check them out. So they're both sitting in Peter's office, and you can check them out for a couple hours. For small objects, the best thing, we don't have it, but the best thing would be a turntable, and to just set this up on something like a tripod, something where it's static, and the object will capture. Anybody want to try these? I'll show you. So the bowl, I mentioned that I ended up using a version of the bowl that had a lot of error in it. So I ended up with this, but that's what I was hoping for.
Welcome to the world.
So this is the Fearless Girl. And you can see that this bottom gets a little, for what I'm working on, I like the errors, so that doesn't bother me. By the way, this is the terrain tool with the texture from something that I put together in Photoshop. And so these are the less precise scans of the bowl. Anyway, so if you're making something experimental, the errors and things not coming out perfectly can be, I think, can be an advantage. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Actually, before I do, I wanted to pull in the OBJ. So this folder is directly from that 3D, what is it called? From the 3D scanner app. And so it comes with the texture and the 3D information. I can load it right into Unity. I recorded in a dark room, so it's pretty, the texture is pretty dark. And I couldn't see the button. So I ended up with that, but if you're working with a team, then if there's somebody else to help you, then if you're scanning somebody, then it can turn out a lot better. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. Any questions about any of this? Okay, so I recorded everything, including like setting up, switching between scenes and the scripts, and I'll post it this afternoon or this evening.